Welcome everybody, my name's Grant Smith. I work here at Temple Bar as the Education and Outreach Officer, so I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight to listen to this amazing talk we're going to hear from Karl Fender of Fender Katsalidis. Now Karl, this is a bit of an Australian night tonight, isn't it? With me here and you, and we've got Earl sitting down here as well, and it is an Australian practice. Yeah. So Karl is, has been awarded the OAM, which is the Order of Australia Medal, which equates to a knighthood really in Australia, I guess, doesn't it? That's the closest thing you get now they've done away with knighthoods.
Oh, damn it. Yeah, I know. I wish it had have happened here, because then I would be a knight.
You would be a knight, yes.
Which is much better than an OAM. But anyway.
So his practice was founded in 95?
Yes.
And he also works, there's a practice here, a sister studio here, which Earl heads up, and that's the AFK studio. I think that's the abbreviation you use, isn't it? Yep. So, which is Arnie Fender Katsalidis, am I right? The AFK. So, Karl has just chaired the Council for Tall Buildings and Urban Habitats in Chicago, and chaired the jury, I beg your pardon, for that event. And he's very interested in, obviously, urban realm, urban design, and it should be a fascinating talk. I'm looking forward to seeing a lot of these images that you've got, having previewed the slide deck. There's images and paintings that I'm familiar with from my boyhood in Australia as well. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Karl.
Well, thanks for taking the interest. It's great to be here, and it's great to have an opportunity to talk about building tall, which I assume you're all interested in. By the way, are we architects, or just we are all architects? No, thank you. One sane person. Look, building tall, it's just, it's fantastic to be back in London. I've just been in Chicago, and I've just come to London. I've just come from a lunch where urban habitat, building tall has been discussed. I'm sort of getting an appreciation of how complex the issues are about densification in London, building tall, the places for habitation that are appropriate and not appropriate. Very complex. I have to say I got a bit overwhelmed by it. And it's definitely a kind of a moment in the evolution of tall buildings. Certainly in Chicago, the interest this year, and by the way, it was the first time we've had a meeting in Chicago for 3 years because of COVID. And that's the other nice thing about tonight. It's an intimate gathering, and it's face to face. It's not bloody Teams. And but in Chicago, and by the way, the audience there was 1,000 people. So this is fantastic. It's much more relaxing. But CTBUH is about the tall building. It's about the engineering, the science. It's about sustainability, and sustainability issues are becoming really, really critical these days. It's about urban habitat, but mostly it's sort of focusing on the evolution of tall buildings as a piece, as an assemblage, and how that's to be done in the future in terms of sustainability. And so what I'm really interested in, because there's a lot of people that know a lot more about how to make buildings sustainable than me. We go to consultants, we have to have, like all of us, a sort of broad interest in and a commitment to the greening of buildings. And but it's the urban habitat. These buildings, in Melbourne, they get criticised. Oh, tall building, and it's not a place to live. It's not this, it's not that. And you'll see as I go through. But it's what tall buildings can bring to a place. And that covers a lot of territory, a lot of different aspects to that. And I thought that just tonight I'd run through some of the thoughts, but it comes out of a history of the changes that have happened in Melbourne in particular over the last 20 years, which have been profound, really been profound. So without further ado, and with your indulgence, I'm going to start at the start, which was, this is the start of tall buildings. This was the start of the suburbs in Melbourne. This is my parents in 1956, having come as immigrants. They were Dutch from Indonesia, coming here with me, and after 4 years, having saved up enough to buy a house for £4,000 in those days. But it was a house in the new suburbs, and the new suburbs had unmade streets, no sewerage, no stormwater. It was a house that had an outhouse as a toilet. The end of the street was a barbed wire fence, and there was a forest. And this was considered to be the outer suburbs. It's now the inner suburbs. So they were pioneers, and they were the start of a trend of migration into Australia, post-war migration. And the suburbs were a kind of curious thing, and people like John Brack, a great Australian artist, were kind of consumed by the notion of this sort of suburban life. It was the great Australian dream. Everyone a house and a quarter-acre block. And people like Howard Arkley celebrated it. These artists were just taken by the housing and the typology and the strangeness of it all. And John Brack again, you know, so you lived in a suburb, you had a car, the family, it was an outing, and it's very funny because there's my father, mother and me in the Hillman Minx. And I love that slide because these artists were just so kind of spot on in their interpretations of suburban life. But that's what happens. It becomes an oil slick. You put the oil on the water, it goes to infinity. The suburbs spread and spread and spread, and obviously that's not a sustainable housing model. It means you need cars, traffic, emissions, the whole catastrophe, and it's a bit of a sterile way of life. You might have known your neighbours and hopefully you got on well. Often you didn't. And the city itself was devoid of residential. Melbourne was a commercial centre, and at 5:30 the office stopped. People went to the pub for half an hour, a few schooners, got in the car and drove to the suburbs, or got on the train. And that's John Brack again. It's called Melbourne at 5:30 p.m. And so in 95, I came back from working around the world, and I started to practice with Dr. Katsalidis in 95, and we were interested in A, getting work, but B, residential. And so this was our first residential building in Melbourne City, and one of the first, if not the first residential building in Melbourne. And how did we get that job? Because Nonda was the developer. And we were able to do something that actually caught on. There's a lot about this building that's very near and dear, but this building would now be a tall building. But this was experimental in a way, but it was very successful, and it was about 95 apartments. It brought art to the street. We were interested in, you know, the whole aspect of architecture, talking to the public. The car park had planting, and the three developers each had a statue made by Peter Collette. This chap was a very slender young man, and that was his fantasy. And this was the bride's fantasy. So every Saturday they would come along and have their photos taken, rubbing the. It's like the foot of St. Peter's, and this is great. This is about art. Activating the street and being enjoyed by people. And the building itself was about concrete, you know, concrete that would weather, need no maintenance, and could be made into an art form, a sculptural form. An office building that was interesting at the time because there was no residential in Melbourne, and we dared to put 2 apartments on the top that interlocked to give 360 views for everybody. But this was a discussion with council, and the only way that at that time we could bring a residential in was to negotiate art, and so, you know, curated glass art on the street. And this was Melbourne in its kind of residential infancy, but it brought apartments, and you could see the potential of living in the city, in apartments, in the sky, and it was the start of a movement. Our next project back in those days, and this is now, this was completed year 2000, was Republic Tower. So Melbourne Terrace, the one I just showed, was 90 families horizontally. This is 90 families vertically. Again, a concrete building, quite robust, but it brought, you know, some terrific apartments and life in the sky started to become appreciated, whereas it was unimaginable beforehand. And you can see here, it was a difficult site. It had a funnel down to the tube station, to the tube below, and that became somewhere we couldn't build. So we used it as public art, again, bringing art to the street, a changing art program. So these were very early explorations about the public realm. How do buildings talk? How do they improve the context they're in? And you know, sustainability, as we now understand it and now pursue, was not really known that well back then. It was kind of not in the mindset, but a lot's happened. You know, global warming. We're getting flooded in Melbourne now, so these things have really come to the fore. The public art changed every month with a ceremony or a celebration in the streets, and motorbike cops came and stopped the traffic, and they got angry and hooted, and we drank in the middle of the street, and the thing was unveiled once every 3 months. It was a terrific sort of community engagement program. And this was, you know, and then on a city street, the idea of a timber trellis, which is now fully festooned with planting. And these were things that were quite outrageous at the time, believe it or not. Then we got into tall, quite tall. 300 metres, this building. It's called Eureka Tower. And again, these buildings were all driven by my partner, Nonda Katsalidis at the time, developer. We were just impoverished architects, but we had linkages to other people that had some cash. And they became development partners, and we were able to do this. Now, this was outrageous. 300 metres tall, 600 apartments, and it came at a time when living in apartments was still a bit sort of unknown and untested in Melbourne, and we marketed this in the year 2000, and it was an incredible success. So there was a thirst for this. Is that a wind-up? Pizza's coming. Pizza. Yeah, so, but this had a permit for 2 towers. We went to the planning minister and said, you know, we could do this tomorrow, but what if we did this? Less shadow, because the shadow travelled thin and fast, less wind downdrafts, great views, and an amazing game changer for Melbourne, you know. It became a kind of an icon in Melbourne, and it was always behind newsreaders. It was the Tower of Power during an election, and the 2 parties were going, coloured things going up the tower. It became part of the spirit of the city, and it was quite sculptural, so it was not just a normal extrusion where everything's the same however you look at it. It had shoulders which scaled down to the buildings around it, and it had a crescendo at the top. But importantly, it put a public sky deck at the top. So where there would normally be a rich person living in a great apartment, it was actually public domain, and that to us was really, really important, and it still operates very, very successfully. But and pardon me, and public art. We built this thing. We were a bit cheeky, and we built that out to the centre of the road. No one seemed to notice. But it was a great. We knew we were going to have public art, and an artist called Richard Stringer made these bees. These bees are giant. They're like these huge things that he made. We hoisted them up. There's not a day that goes by that there aren't people looking and going, what's all that about, and photographing. And again, public engagement, bringing enrichment to the street. And it also created a pocket park. It created a laneway which connected the river on the right to the street at the rear. So Melbourne's all about laneways. It public art, and it had mixed use. So there was commercial, retail, F&B, all in the base podium. And it was a great exploration and hugely successful, which made us very proud about Melburnians, because Melbourne is a place of culture, art, thinking, talking. It's a great communicating city. And for us to do an experiment like that, where everything's on the line and people actually love it, and there are still people like me that live in there from the day it was started. It wasn't about quick turnover. It filled a gap. In fact, that's my apartment. I'm in one of the beaks, and just to demonstrate that when you're up there, you've got this view that's just all around you, and this is a reflection of the city behind and the bay. So Melbourne was really coming of age with respect to high-rise buildings. And the sustainability of this is really in the fact that the apartments ventilate, open windows. It wasn't a garret. And what it did, it housed 600 families that would otherwise be way out in the suburbs, potentially, and on the doorstep of the city. And we thought, if one's okay, well, let's do another one, called Australia 108, which was even a bit taller than the one on the right. And this is a photograph. And sometimes we are quite above the clouds. So these are city-changing buildings. They really are. They change the physicality of the city, the symbolism of the city, the international relevance of the city, and it gives great homes for people, and it brings mixed use. And again, on these, we're very interested in the public realm and the offering for the people that live in there, equitable space, so people that live down here and around the corner without a view can actually use what we call the starburst, which is where all the facilities are. So if I live in a very small apartment, I can go up into that space with kitchen, dining and all of those sort of things, and I can entertain 20, 50 people if I want to, and enjoy the view. And so I'm part of a community. The building sits on a very, very busy street of Melbourne. That's Eureka Tower. So they act as sentinels. They're not, the materiality was chosen carefully so that they did read as sentinels, male, female, brother, sister, whatever you like, but they actually became quite a powerful gateway, one of the gateways to Melbourne. And it's on a very sensitive soil condition. It could not really build basements, and the car parking had to go above ground, and so the car parking became a landscape. So this is usually what it is today, a very, very, very busy street, and the council has gardening upgrades, and the gardens rise up the base of the building, and there are certain heritage aspects that have been retained. So again, it's concentrating on A, the emblem, and B, the ground plane, the human realm, and making it a place of engagement. So this is a close-up of the what we call it's a sky deck, and it's based on the Commonwealth star on the Australian flag, Australia 108, the flag, the star. But it just puts a kind of an art object up into the sky, and within that component, there's a couple of infinity pools. It's just facilities, fantastic facilities in the sky for people to be occupants, places for events, celebrations, kitchens, lounges, virtual golf, gymnasiums, all the things that you would expect. So, yeah, did I hear San Gimignano? Yeah, what a fantastic place. So the people that a lot of the people that love this, how could you not, are also the naysayers that say, high-rise is bad. You know, it's NIMBYism, not in my backyard. So a tall building is threatening to a lot of people. The sort of stuff that they were saying at this time as we were starting to do high-rise in the city of Melbourne was crazy things. High-rise living has a number of drawbacks, including social isolation and diminished public realm amenity. And it's a city that is unlivable within a generation. It's like, it was crazy stuff. They were just for the sake of being able to, I mean, if you change your letterbox, a neighbour would complain in Melbourne. So the high-rise apartments were really, really under some scrutiny. And to say that people living in a high-rise tower have no amenity is crazy, because the amenities at your doorstep, the city, the parks, the gardens, the cultural events, this is, but that's what we went through. And, you know, and what they forget too is that there's 1,100 apartments inside Australia 108, and it sits on 3/4 of an acre, which, if you translate that to houses, is about 220 acres out in the suburbs. So, you know, 1,100 homes in the space of 3 or 4 homes. That's sustainability, I think, because that's a huge number of vehicles that are not driving in from the suburbs for an hour a day each way and giving off emissions. That's sustainability socially, for the opportunity that people have to be able to live near the city. And I know this is quite different to London, but it's our journey through high-rise or tall buildings and the sort of responsibilities they face in different locations. So this is a view out of my apartment, by the way. You know, above the clouds sometimes. It's just absolutely fantastic. And everybody in that building gets that view. And these are just some of the skies that I photograph in the morning, during the day, and sometimes you're in the cloud. That's not so bad either. It's like Japanese Soji screens, and there's something that's quite beautiful about that. So every day to me, and every day to people that live in this building or any other higher rise buildings, is different, is wonderful. You wake up to things that you were never aware of when you live on the ground. And I'm not denying living on the ground. I'm just saying that there is an option to not live on the ground. And I don't think people should be so overcritical about options, because they might be very happy in the country house or in a suburban house. And I'm just saying that there's a lot of housing opportunities available in Melbourne, and it's a great thing. It's one of the great things about Melbourne, as no doubt they are in London, even more manifested by the kind of power of London and the densities and, you know, all of those considerations and options. But we are at a time where buildings are now being incredibly scrutinised, tall buildings, because they're considered to be consumers. And there are people that are really looking hard around the world. And we've got this terrific group in Melbourne called Finding Infinity, who are about how to transform the city from being a consumer to a producer. And that comes down to the building elements of the city, the buildings. How can we make all buildings producers and not consumers? And this is a key to what we're doing, and they call that the new normal. And their thesis is that within a decade you could actually have a net positive energy situation in buildings by doing certain things with existing buildings. And there's a whole catalogue of things which I don't need to go through because you all know them better than me. But it's to get to a circular economy in terms of building materials, zero operating costs, and a payback for the capitalisation to achieve that within 10 years. of course, it's beautiful, but it needs buy-in, engagement. It needs engagement by community. It needs engagement by government, but it also needs an understanding that the embodied carbon in existing buildings can be extended into a new lifetime if you keep them. Because the buildings in Melbourne, buildings in Australia now are at 50 years, and they are at kind of end of useful life in a way, but the structure's still robust. And if you can take those and reimagine them, then they can become very, very interesting and relevant components of the city. So a couple of little examples, and this goes way back, and they're little engaged. This is in Richmond, and it was a silo, 4 silos. But in Richmond, you could not build over 2 stories, and this silo was 7 stories. So by just adding on to it, we all of a sudden, we got a 7-story building. And we got very interesting apartments. It was done by taking the silo forms and adding the eyeball shape onto it, and extruding it up, and it was shaped like this so that the rear neighbours could get sight lines still. We didn't go beyond, even though the site was bigger. And there it is, and it's a kind of interesting thing to come across, but it's using what we have. And if it had been pulled down and another building put there, there would have been a lost opportunity of memory, a lost opportunity of sculpture, and a lost opportunity of a sustainable approach. And another one, this is a building that was the old Postal Hall Telephone Exchange in the city of Melbourne, the first taller building that was built after the war. They built them strong in those days. And so Nonda, again, bought this in syndication, and we went ahead and put a building on top, 7 stories, steel, lighter weight, and turned it into residential. So offices became residential. There was retail brought down into the Postal Hall. This is in the city centre on the corner of Little Burke and Russell Street. And all of a sudden, and I know we had a discussion today over lunch about bringing residential into London, and I was just overwhelmed by all the arguments about, not arguments, but realities of why that's very difficult to do. But luckily in Melbourne, we have the space and place and opportunity to convert, to get people into the city, and it's quite a different paradigm. Melbourne closed down. London is such a force. It's got all of that retail and interest and pageantry at ground level. We didn't have that. We don't have that population. We don't have that demand. So Melbourne, it was absolutely necessary to balance it, to get people into the city, so that you could not buy a litre of milk in the city in the 70s. There was no need to have after hours retailing or F&B, because everyone went home. It was the exodus every day to the suburbs. But this is a recent one, actually. It was 2 in Brisbane. And this is about sustainability, taking it as far as we could. 2 early 80s office towers, end of useful life. Pull them down, build a beautiful thing. No, we kept it. We kept the 2 towers. We just took everything off the towers and stripped out the ceilings, reclad it with a very efficient glazing, shaded glazing system, and filled the void between the 2 with a mixed mode zipper space, I suppose, and created from 2 900 square metre floor plates, 1 2,000 square metre floor plate. So that was a very flexible space. Again, keeping all of that structure, recladding it, resurfacing it floor to floor, mixed mode with ventilation through the building. And I think we just won a sustainability award through our institute for this building. It's quite a rare thing. I can't think of any other building in the world that's been joined to make one building. But it needs the commitment of clients. So here's a test fit floor. There's one building, and this piece in the middle that is a meeting place, a place where you can have interfloor connections without having to go to the elevators and all of that. So, and then there's, so next generation workspace. And of course, we couldn't resist but put another few floors on the top. So increasing the workability of that piece in the city of Brisbane, retaining the heritage site, creating through-block links, creating gardens in the sky. And I haven't, I feel a bit, I've had to rush through these because there's quite a bit, but each of these projects have got so many aspects. It is about the livability of buildings, but all of these positives in terms of reusing buildings, it's just something that you can't ignore. And new buildings, producers rather than consumers, so water, waste and power, dealing with that, reskinning efficiently, sealing, batteries, electrifying the building, all of this again to get to zero operating costs and infrastructural payback over 10 years. But keep coming back to the equitable use of space on the ground floor for the public, the way these can improve the local area and community. And so this is a piece of South Yarra, which is an inner suburban, quite a beautiful suburb, but the council had created a pedestrian link from this very busy major retail street through to Yarra Street, which is on the railway. And it just didn't function. There was no reason for people to go there. It wasn't very nice. And so when we developed this piece here, we created a node which expanded the walkway into a place for F&B, for music, for buskers, for, in other words, enriching the trail. And we did that in unison with the council, who said, well, if you do that, if you pay for that, we will allow you some further development rights, because you can do that without any negative impacts on the neighbours. And we did. So these sort of things need to have the collaboration of council or state government. The sustainability issues are never going to be, in the broader sense, are never going to be driven by countries or major national government. It's got to happen through the city, and it's got to happen through the suburban councils, because they can drive it, and they can make arrangements site specifically with the developers. So by doing this, the timber trellis in the street, which has cascading gardens and people, it's space making, place making, and very, very important to the public realm. Another project in Melbourne, twin towers near the Victoria markets. This tower is now under, this tower's finished, this one's being built, this will be built to rent, this is apartments, very successful. So a range of apartment types, which is kind of equitable. So build to rent has become on very strong over the COVID period. And the millennials love it because it's a light touch for them. The leases are easy, they're not big apartments, and they have a lot of communal gathering places. They like people, they like hanging around with computers out there. And so that's kind of an interesting residential offering at both ends of the scale. But importantly, the podium builds on the tradition of the Melbourne laneways. And so it's another interpretation of the Melbourne laneway, but it's filled with home studios, retail, F&B, and it just adds another layer of richness to the ground level activities of the city. And these two buildings, a hotel and an apartment building, right opposite a World Heritage Park in Melbourne, and the park is carried across the road and up through the podium with a ballroom, through block links. And again, this is all about equitable social spaces, and I think it's sort of social sustainability. And then sustainability, the the careful use of small sites that would otherwise be useless. And this is a 6 metre wide site. In fact, you all know what slip forming is. It's how you build the cores of buildings by jumping the formwork, and that's how this building was built. We have an earthquake thing, so there's about that much space got to be between buildings, just enough space for a slip form. So this was slip formed, and that's the building. It's got a slenderness ratio of about, I think it's about 1 in 12, something like that. And it's one apartment per floor with a mechanical car park stacker, and it's on one of the entries into the city. So this is a site again that the planning rules changed, and at a certain level you have to step in. If you step in and you step in, you could get a staircase going there, nothing else. So this, you know, these things have to be site specific, and this was before the rules. We had an artist do a kind of an urban art piece up the wall. Another one, Melbourne Quarter, which is again residential and rental apartments, but you know, all the amenities look out onto a garden. Where's that garden? On top of the car park. And through this garden you get a linkage down to Flinders Street, which is the river, and up into the city centre, which is the business district. And so it's making places and spaces for people, for the enjoyment both of all the residents and another park for Melbourne, which is you know, based on parks. This one is in Canberra. It's a sketch that I did at the start of this project, which was all about an existing, I think it was a 50s hotel. A hotel, it was residentials for the politicians. Canberra is the sort of political centre of Australia. And then there were these spaces left over for buildings. So, all about the public realm. This was called Nishi, which means west in Japanese, and it produced in Canberra, which was all a very elitist place, 50 square metre apartments. We went to Japan and we found a little group called Suppose of architects, and we collaborated with them, and they did 50 square metre apartments in here, which had through ventilation, which were like living in works of art, living in sculptures. You know David Umamoto, the sculptor? He's just, well, look him up. He does amazing sculptures that you kind of want to be in, and that's what these young guys did with us. And but importantly, it was annexed to an office building, which at the time was 6-star Green Star. It was only 6-star Green Star in Australia, and it had the largest array of photovoltaics on the roof. It had a courtyard or an atrium in the middle, so that we got through ventilation. This timber screen shaded the north elevation, and it's now, all of these are planter boxes, so it's got a lot of planting. It reflected light off the blades into the building. It was just, it was a very, very sustainable building, and it was clipped onto the residential with an atrium in the middle, and also an entry foyer that led to theatres, hotel, F&B, all in this one building. And so this again is about public realm and adding. Canberra was a car park with buildings, and this became a precinct that had art in the courtyards. The buildings were regarded as art forms. There was art, everything was art. And it was significant because it changed Canberra. It really did. All of a sudden, there was an exemplar of how people could live, of how buildings could operate. And this was the next building, which again, actually this was the first building. This was retail, F&B, commercial and residential, mixing the uses, making the building sculptural, interesting, and of mixed use. And this was the tower on the site, which again really worked the urban art, Corten waterfalls, artists designing the lobbies, the elevator ride with a glass wall up a vertical art piece. So again, really concentrating on the public realm. But just for a bit of light relief, public realm is also buildings in the bush. This is called Garangular Art Gallery, It's not a tall building, but it's very concerned about another issue, and that is the Indigenous engagement. So we apologised. One of our Prime Ministers finally apologised for the treatment that certain pioneers of Australia inflicted on the Indigenous owners of the land. And now we usually start every talk with an acknowledgement, and on a lot of the work that we do now, we involve Indigenous people and try to get back to the lessons that they are giving us with respect to respecting the land. And so this is working with Indigenous advisors, materials that are characteristic, rammed earth. This is Corten, and this is an art piece, which is a window screen, which is representational of Indigenous shields. And this is what they do inside. So it doesn't have to be tokenism. It quite often is. A building might be near a river that used to have eels where they fished, and so that they draw eels in the pavement. It's very kind of tokenistic, but if you can get to the essence, sometimes you can get some great results. And the Indigenous, the brief for this, by the way, was 100 pieces of art, all Indigenous, because this was a Swiss financier, and he had an Indigenous art collection because he had an Aussie wife, and he came out and got interested in Australian art. And so our chore was house 100 pieces of art, do it in a building that did not need to be air conditioned, but that in its shell could stand closure and evenness of temperature, and also for 100 pieces of art and 100 people for dinner. So it comprises a double-loaded corridor in a way, with these boxes that house the art, and because a lot of Aboriginal art was in caves. So rather than just a gallery with painting after painting after painting and whatever, they were contained in these caves, and these are pier timbers and the river into which the pier sat before its demise. And the corridor in the middle became a banquet hall, and we could turn all the walls that made the corridor or made the divisions could turn around and bring the art into the corridor, and 100 people could sit there and have dinner. It was a bit hard to converse with number 100 down there, but it was it worked very well. And again, this is about context. So this is the Mona Art Gallery, quite a remarkable place. If you ever go to Australia, please go to Tasmania. Please go to this, because it's changed the world of art, actually, or the world of housing art. This is a man that made a lot of money through incredible mathematical mind, and on probabilities, he gambles on horses. He wins a lot of money, and he puts it into his art collection, and it all happens inside this building. But instead of putting, and this is a building that replaces the bank of the river, instead of putting this object of desire, like the Frank Gehry's thing in Spain, which is all about the object and not about the art. Mind you, I still love going there because I think it kind of works as a gallery at any rate. But this is making the building the bank. And so it's cut into the riverbank, and this is what you get inside. All these incredible sandstone chambers. So this is actually an elevator that goes up into an old Roy Grounds house. So the entry to this museum is a kind of listed house. And you go into the house and you walk down the spiral stair or down the elevator, and you come into this kind of chamber. And when you turn the corner, you come down, there's a bar on the right, and you turn the corner. I don't have one over long, but there's I'm sure I had one. Let me just, I might have done that too quickly. No. Okay, so that connects to a corridor of sandstone which has pieces cut out. This is a water sculpture that drops words. I was there one day, you know, and I was showing some clients, Chinese clients, and I was just photographing it. And when I got home, I realised that the third word that came down was Karl. Is that bizarre? But that's, you know, it's a place of moments. These are the most frequently used words on Google or something. There must have been a famous Karl that died or something, at any rate. But you can see that the extraordinary spaces, by making that decision not to have a piece on top, but to cut into the riverbank, to keep it low profile, but then to also be able to have chambers where circulation within the place gave you an understanding of the museum and became sculpture in itself. And other spaces like this one that has the Sydney Nolan collection of paintings to do with flowers, and just so by doing that you don't necessarily lose the ability to have, you know, very beautiful collection spaces. And this guy then provides the transportation from Hobart to the museum on the water. So these are the sort of things that where developers become incredibly important, and they are quite enlightened, but they're often hampered by the cost of things, the cost of sustainability. And so this guy, though, I mean, he makes a lot of money, and he makes it quite easily. He's got an incredible mind, and he's put it to good use. Which takes me to building tall, and this is the last project. So we had built Eureka, and we'd built Australia 108, they're tall buildings. And we had a client came to me with a fax saying, would you be interested in doing a tall building? Okay. That led to us getting a project called Merdeka 118. And Merdeka means independence or freedom. And it's called Merdeka 118 because it's 118 stories, and it's on the site where independence was declared by Tunku Abdul Rahman in 1957. And they came to us because it's a very tall building. It's now the second tallest building in the world. You're nodding, you know it?
I heard about this.
Okay, so it's just reached its, you know, pinnacle, and it'll take another 7 months to finish the interiors. But they came to us because we're in the region. There was no one in KL that had any experience with tall buildings, and they happened to stumble across Eureka Tower, and that looks pretty big when you stand under it. So we got a job. Crazy. You can go into competitions like this, spend $1 million and not get it. I got a fax saying it's yours, which I didn't believe. But at any rate, it wasn't long after that we really were going hell-bent for leather, and that was 13 years ago. So this building sits on the site of Stadium Merdeka and Stadium Negara. It was in here that Tunku Abdul Rahman declared independence, famously putting his hand up saying, "We are free." This is now the new Malaysia, and this is going to be a nation of science, integrity, commerce, and all the things that make countries fantastic. The stadium, and then later the Stadium Negara, was designed by Stanley Jukes, who actually was an American architect, but he was very close to Tunku Abdul Rahman, and he got some terrific commissions. And but this is what we were confronted with: putting a tower that is 678.9 metres tall right on their stadium, which is a flat plain stadium. So talk about NIMBYs, wow. Can you imagine what the locals were saying? what are they doing? How can they put this huge building? You know, they're killing our stadium. They're killing. You know, it was very negative at the start. Oh, and see, this was all sort of gardens once, and they're taking our gardens away. They're doing this. They're doing that. And there's the day that it was declared, and this was the site as we found it. And by the way, the gardens were really just gravel, which had motorbikes parked on it, and a quarry, which was the start of a failed development, and this strange battle axe site. I was told I had 6 weeks to develop 6 designs for a tower to present to the Prime Minister, which is a bit crazy, you know, 6 weeks. At any rate, we did, and luckily there were 6 versions in little models, and he picked the one with guidance, which was the one that had to be built, and we were up and away. But usually if you're given a tower to design, there's a site. Like Earl's, what's your last?
55.
55
Bishopsgate.
Bishopsgate. Okay, there's the site. Get as much on as you can. Here was a site, and where would you put a building? So I thought, well, this is actually beyond just designing a building, and it's on a really incredibly important historical site. So there were a few challenges there. And again, I keep taking this back to public realm, towers giving back to the city, however you can do it. And so this was incredibly important. There had been a previous scheme by a local firm. It was a village of towers. It was an even scattering, and there was no public space. It was just a village of towers. And they designed it in the local Muslim Malaysian tradition with domes and gold, and you know, that could have been a church or a mosque, and then extruded it, and overwhelming this because it's a wall. So, not to be too critical, the people that then bought it, PNB, the largest funds management group in Malaysia, actually wanted to do something to give back more. So they reparcelised the land, and we came up with a design of the tower in this location here, which was on axis with Stadium Negara, not on axis with this. I mean, you'd love to have put it there, but it was all too tight. But by putting it here, it created an axis which actually provided a pedestrian link from Chinatown through the building and down a park that's 200 metres long, almost a quarter of a kilometre, and 60 metres wide, which was designed through competition by Sasaki out of Boston. And so immediately it was starting to talk about public realm, public access, public improvement. Just up the road were the Petronas Towers by Caesar Pelle. Beautiful, beautiful towers. And they were basically sponsored by the Prime Minister Mahathir. And we didn't want to compete. Based on Muslim pattern and extruded up and incredibly lit at night. So our tower became not that at all. It became a crystalline form. Crystalline actually disturbs the wind, so you don't get wind vortexes. It was also, in our mind, became crystalline, and by celebrating the folds and the structural pathways, it was all triangulated. And it was explained to the Prime Minister that the triangles very loosely or subtly were symbolic of the very rich cultural divisions, or not divisions, but sections of the community. It's very, it's very culturally diverse and interesting, and this particular Prime Minister was all about the one Malaysia. So I was able to say to him, this is symbolic of all the different people and types and social groups that make up the community of Malaysia, but brings them all together as the one Malaysia, which he bought. But it was also inspired by the Songket patterns in the material, the Malaysian patterns. So that's just one example. But there's a lot of triangles and that sort of thing in both Muslim and local pattern making. And so this is the building as it faces the water park that Sasaki designed. A water park that starts at the tower as ponds, waterfalls, cascades, comes along as what they call the Silver River and becomes eventually a spray. So the kids can go there, play in the spray, annoy their parents, and that's right on the entry of Stadium Merdeka, and it now has a mosque that's been designed and a history museum at the end of it. So it becomes a place of gathering, a new place for the people of Malaysia. And you can turn, if there's a function in the stadium, which there are concerts, there are all sorts of things, you can turn it all off and you've got a kind of assembly area or a pre-function area in the front of the stadium for the crowds. It sits on top of again, a crystalline form podium, which is all eroded around the base, so that Malaysia, for anyone that's been there, you know that it's hot, it rains, it can just come upon you. So many retail podiums just come to ground, and they don't talk about the architecture of the tower above. The tower is this thing, and then there's a box. The crystalline form obviously comes out of the tower, and it enables people to be under. There's food streets, there's gardens cut into the top or into the roof, which support the activities in these three residential towers. And within this tower, it's basically commercial, hotel, restaurants in the roof, sky deck, and the ability to climb 50 metres, which is almost a bit more than a third of the way up that spire in a double helix, so that you can appreciate the view without anything around you over KL. This is the dome over the retail, 100,000 square metres of retail, and the dome obviously is talking to the dome of Stadium Negara. But, you know, with retail, it's 6 levels of retail. People don't go up there, so there needs to be something up there that is quite amazing. The other thing that it does is from the retail inside, you can see the tower. If you go into a lot of retail boxes, you have no idea where you are. So you can see sky patterns, you can see the tower, and it's a kind of majestic space inside. And so when you when you come down from the sky deck, you traverse across the roof over a garden, and you come into the top level of the retail. So that's a 6th level, there's retail down here, and under that dome many things can happen. This is one idea about it being a really luscious art garden. The tower is a diamond form. It's got, is this okay? Am I boring you with, okay, so these things are engineering, I guess you could call them masterpieces in a way, of human endeavour. There are 3 belt truss zones. So you have a centre core, you have outriggers, which are huge 3-storey trusses that come out from the core and attached to the mega columns. There are 8 mega columns around the building. These big things, they're about 3 metres by 4 metres. They're a bit like this room, or half of this room. And then the belt truss runs around and hangs the floors from columns, so that there's structural pathways. If anything gets taken out, then the loads find other pathways down. So unlike world trade, mind you, I don't know if anything can withstand an A380 flying into it, but for lesser events, maybe, it won't fall down. You're late.
Apologies.
There's a lease span of 12 metres, which is an optimum lease span for light to core. Works well for hotel, and it's a floor-to-ceiling curtain wall because the views were so important. But these days we're really talking about shaded facades. This is kind of shaded on the inside because with mega columns, secondary columns, spandrels, it's about 50% vision glass and 50% not. So it's not as though it's just these huge glass walls. They're very, very efficient double glazed walls with the outer glazing. They're double glazed, but the outer is laminated glass as well for safety. That's a quick. Okay, they're the belt trusses, the secondary columns, the mega columns, and these are the humongous three-storey trusses. Now, where those occur, they're the public spaces. They're like the piazzas of the building. So as you go and you transfer to get to your floor, they're meeting places. Now, we talk about biophilic interiors. These, they have a bit of planting in these spaces, but really, they're spaces about view, about meeting. The biophilic place is on the ground. Because what we felt is that if we could make incredible gardens on the ground plane, that's where people would come. So why would you stay up there looking at a garden on the other side of the glass when there's an incredible view and you could be downstairs in a water park? So we concentrated the nature on the ground where it ought to be. There's a tremendous move towards the greening of buildings, and I think the work by Woha in Singapore is really incredible and fantastic. And it's open, so the gardens are on the pathways and you touch and feel the planting, and that's a terrific thing. But in this, it's an office building, not a hotel. And so the idea of the social places is where you transit, where you meet, where you wait, where you... it's a different kind of order of priorities. So there's more than one way in sort of the interior of these buildings. This is the sky deck. If you're game enough, you can get into these double-storey elevators and fly up the outside of the building at 9 metres a second and get to the sky deck. And then if you're really game, you can climb up into this spire and I've done it. It nearly killed me. Malaysia's hot and it's humid and it's wet. And I've been, to roof gardens where I step out and I think, I can't do this. I've got to go back inside. So that's why we concentrated the garden outside and had a microclimate with water. So this is the building now built. These are actual photos, not renders. This is the north elevation, and that's the elevators up here. Two double stories. Top story delivers to sky deck. Bottom story delivers to restaurant. You can see the folds and whatnot. So again, it's a crystalline form because it changes wherever you look because it's reflecting differently, and it's an object rather than a reflection. So bird strikes, are not an issue because they're clever enough to know that that's not sky. If it was just flat glass and it was perfectly flat, and it's not on a flight path. Now, am I doing okay? I'm getting close to the end. Is everyone okay?
Yeah. We're just worried about the food as well, but don't worry about that.
How long has it been?
No, you're all right. You're fine. You're right.
Okay, I'll be about another 5 minutes, I'd say.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's got two lobbies, one onto Jalan Hang Jebat, which is where Chinatown is, comes in, there's sort of 30-metre spaces, it comes up, escalators to an upper lobby with a 30-storey atrium, which is all about dragging air through and exhausting air and getting air current through there. And this is the garden and the water garden down here. And so the this is okay. So this is from Chinatown, arriving by car, and you know, often you get into an undercroft, you've got no idea where you are. So the undercroft is opened up so you can see the building. You always know where you are. But what would you do? You're all architects. What would you do inside for a lobby? Yeah, pretty interesting.
What would I do inside?
Just to design a lobby inside this thing.
Yeah, I like the idea of having open, skylights. Yes.
Yeah, and
definitely.
that was carried into the lobby, and we were a bit, we loved the
Mexico.
Gomantong caves, with light emanating from above, water on the walls, sort of randomness and structural nature of it, and so the interior became something like that. All of the interior is travertine stone, and this is a giant lobby that has the hotel lobby on one side of a water feature, and it has a water cascade coming down the face of the elevators. So when you start in the elevator from down here, you're behind a water wall, and then you emerge through the roof to the view, and it's all about the theatre of the and the curation of the event. But also, I demanded that the hotel didn't start for them in terms of interior design until they got up to the elevators. So this became one piece, not the Park Hyatt entry with all its livery and a change in total feeling. But they get the benefit of the volume. And this is the side where you go up into the upper lobby with F&B and a place for photographers and and the tower core comes down like a stalactite, poof, inside a stone environment, and that's currently being clad. And as you get as you come up here, up the escalators and through here, and you start to arrive at the upper atrium, you arrive in this space. So we've come up here, turned around. That's the 30-story part of the atrium. This is the information kiosk. We called it the Manenka Bar, which is a kind of tribal hat, and which looks like that. It's backlit onyx, and everything else is travertine. And this is the entry, the secure entry into the building. But anybody can go through here. So this is a sheltered pathway from Chinatown to the garden and to the monorail beyond. So we're very, very concerned about this building not being a private realm, but being for the public, and obviously with certain securities, but anybody can come up here and pass through. They can get to the retail, they can get to the sky deck, they can get to all sorts of things. Now, as I close up, I just wanted to say that these things have huge budgets. This was 3 billion ringgits just for the tower. With that sort of budget, there's room for these buildings to really give back infrastructure and public realm, etc. It's what you're looking here is road tunnels to bring cars, because it's very congested with cars. They love cars. We had to provide 8,000 car parks. Can you believe it? It's obscene, but it's regulation. And I only hope that one day, when they get sensible and get petrol cars off the road, that a lot of the there are 8 basements full of cars that they can be used for urban gardens, they can be used for electrification, they can be used for electric vehicles, etc. And but anyway, at the moment, kilometres of road work to improve the road network, tunnels to get into this car park. There's a new MTR station underneath the retail that's coming. I didn't believe any of this at the start when they said, oh, we're going to have to bring a subway, a railway station, this or that. I thought, yeah, right, you know, in Melbourne that's a 100-year plan. It's all done. It's amazing. It's all done. And pedestrian access, overpasses, and that's where these buildings have a responsibility. And when you've got an enlightened client like P&B, they couldn't be seen not to be giving back. And that is about social sustainability. And of course, that sustainability's moved on from when we started. There's all sorts of new products, methodologies, etc. But this is a LEED Platinum building, which is a high level, high rating of sustainability. And it's done in a whole bunch of different ways, which you would all be familiar with, but that's just taken for granted. And, the building changes, again, another characteristic that we like, buildings as sculpture rather than just extrusions which look the same from wherever you look at them. The Petronas towers are really beautiful because when you see them and you walk around, they change, you know, the positions change. You kind of know where you are. And this to me is about triangulation, because if you see this building with Petronas and the KL Tower, you know where you are in KL, because it's easy not to know where you are. So it's a statement of history, it's a statement of the future, it's a statement of giving back to the community, it's a statement of sustainability, and it's a statement of confidence in the future. And as you look at the tower from different aspects, it changes. And this, I think this is my last slide. What I really love about this is, without prompting, the people in Malaysia that said, oh, this is ridiculous, blah, blah, blah. Now they say, this is very beautiful, looks like the Tunku Abdul Rahman on the day that he lifted his arm. So they see in this a symbol of their independence. How's that? How would you be designing a building that all of a sudden it's not a gherkin, it's not a walkie-talkie, it's not a cheese grater, it's a symbol of an incredibly important event historically in the evolution of a country. And I had to do a talk in Malaysia a couple of months ago to all of the stakeholders of this project. And one guy stuck his hand up and said, Mr. Fender, this is a question you have to answer. Did you do that on purpose? Did you make this building look like Tunku Abdul Rahman? What did I say?
Of course.
No, I said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to tell you that. So you'd be disappointed, because it was a lose-lose situation. And why would you say something so stupidly obvious and destroy the whole kind of symbolism and, you know, destroy the moment? If you said, yes, well I did, yes, and they would think, what a stupid, silly move, obvious, blah, blah, blah. And if I had have said no, well, how could he be so stupid not to? So better to let the legend go on and have them asking questions. And so, but I'm thrilled, because for a decade I've been thinking, crikey, this is really a huge, huge monument in there. And we did the best we could. It may not be accepted, but fortunately, everyone is very happy with it. So, thank you.
Thank you, Karl. Amazing listening to that back there. I was struck by the coincidences that have happened in your work. And also, I know the suburban house that you grew up in, because I grew up in a similar one, but quite extraordinary to see this sort of journey ending up in the clouds. So thank you very much. I was quite excited by that talk, so thank you. But I think we could throw it over to any questions. Has anybody got any questions for for Karl. Yes, go on.
Well, I wanted to know if you found that Eureka Tower and Australia 108 actually took off some of the burden of suburban housing in Melbourne, or did you find instead it was an opportunity for new money to enter the city?
Oh, it's all of the above and many more things. Everyone gets something out of that in their own sort of hemisphere, in their own values, and their own terms of reference. It was another housing opportunity, and some that wasn't there before. A great thing about Melbourne is you can live in a farm, you can live in a country house, you can live in a beach house, you can live in a suburban house, you can live in a suburban apartment, and this was another urban typology, and that's an offering. If you don't like it, don't go there. If you do like it, you can. So it wasn't to say one thing is wrong and this is right. It was to say Melbourne is a place that provides opportunities, and you have choice. However, there's 1,100 apartments, dwellings, on 3/4 of an acre, on the doorstep of the city, with everything that it has to offer. And Melbourne has gardens, pageantry, retail, events, cultural events, art galleries, netball at your doorstep. And so, is that not a sustainable way of living?
I think it is. I just, sometimes I wonder whether there is a solution for high rises to solve population issues in cities, or like expanding cities. From the point of view that they're in the centre of the city, they are going to be more expensive in general, and people who are living in the exterior of the cities wouldn't actually be able to make the most of them.
Well, I think that's a really good point. It's absolutely spot on. And so what happens is the offer in the city to be affordable gets smaller, and what has to happen is the building industry has to, and we as architects have to find ways to build more economically, so it's more affordable housing. Affordable housing in Melbourne is a problem. It definitely is. And Nonda created a system of building which he tried to introduce into the construction industry, which would have made construction faster, cheaper and more sustainable in terms of carbon footprints. And guess what? Impossible. Because the builders couldn't deal with it. Because it takes a special sort of a builder to build something like that. And there's, relatively speaking, with respect to the numbers of tall buildings, there's very few. And they work within their means, they work within their knowledge. They're not, they're interested in new ways, but not radical new ways. And there's a lot of reasons why systems building, particularly volumetric building, is rejected by builders. And that's a whole other thesis, but it's definitely a problem. It's definitely a problem. We've got to find a way for affordable housing. You're okay if you're middle income, you're okay if you're wealthy, you're almost okay if you're a bit below middle income, but when you come to low income, it's difficult. So, but at least it is moving some of the population. We started off, I'll tell you why Melbourne had a bit of a problem with high-rise, because the first high-rise in Melbourne was built in the 50s. They were called Housing Commission, and it was for people that didn't have income. So it was affordable housing done by government, great sites, great views, but they were concrete slabs, and they became monocultural, and they became homes for the relatively low income earners, and so they became dens of iniquity. They became places where drugs were done and sold, and so everybody, if you talk about housing commission or high rise, they go housing commission. So that was a mental block that we had to get over as we started doing these things. And then you could only you know, we had to start where we had to start, and that was about downsizers. People living in inner suburban houses that the kids left. They wanted to have an apartment in the city, and so that's what we provided. And they had to be more, so those apartments at the start had to be more spacious, and it was those people that would take that offer up, and that led to all the different housing types. But you know, build to rent now is an option, because it means that there's a whole lot of people that don't want the responsibility of a mortgage. They don't want the responsibility of leases which tie them down. They don't want big spaces to themselves. They move around. They are about social activities. So the small apartment, reasonable rent, which is cheaper than paying a mortgage, and the ability to socialise in the spaces. So you put the space out there, all types of different community spaces, and make the habitat private, intimate, and that's really, really taken off.
One of the sort of residential rules that we have in making housing in the UK is that, or in London, is governed by legislation where you have to have external amenity space, so 5 square metres for one bed, 7 for a two. And it was well intentioned, but I think perhaps less appropriate for very tall buildings. So how have you seen that dealt with in your experience? Have you created private internal amenity space that is outside of the normal boundaries of the dwelling, or how have you dealt with it?
The housing that we've been doing is in the city, and at your doorstep. Melbourne is a grid with parks and gardens and cultural precincts, and everything's like a 5 to 10 minute walk. And so if I live in my apartment, I don't actually need a garden. I don't want a garden. In fact, my we've got a winter garden and she's got plants in there. You sort those out. I grew up having to cut grass, water gardens and do all of that, and I have to say I don't have green fingers, and I'm not interested in cutting grass anymore. I am interested in facility though, and convenience, and anybody living in the city of Melbourne is within 5 minutes of a park. And, you know, it's got a river that runs through it, and that is just buzzing with joggers and all of that. 5 minutes to the art galleries. Look, I have a joke now that, you know, beyond 100 metres I'm lost, because I don't have to go beyond 100 metres. I've got my doctor, my dentist, the newspaper, everything, my canteen, my favourite restaurants, and it's all there. And this is the majesty, and that's why it's different in London. So this is not me as a humble architect saying, you guys, look what we do, why don't you do it here? I learnt today very quickly that the pressures on London are very, very different. And we had an empty city and you don't. You have a city that's got incredible vibrance, whether people are living here or not, because it's a great economic powerhouse. It relies on retail and F&B, and it's got surging populations coming through as tourists, and it's totally different. And the debate over lunch was whether it is appropriate to bring housing into the commercial areas, because those people in those houses become objectors to anything that has happened. So it all becomes a political thing. Look, it's complex. There's no simple... You know what? This is a moment where we're facing an unknown future, I think. We're trying everything at the moment to make buildings sustainable, to make them socially equitable. And we're doing it in the face of an economy and a political arena that we just can't tell. I think we'll be okay as architects because we'll still always have things to do, but in terms of the city and how it evolves, that's a different story, and we're there to do the best we can as the forces of economy, the forces of population, the forces of demand start to drive us. And what we have to do is be kind of a bit light on our feet and be open to dealing with these situations that are thrust upon us. I don't think we can change those situations in a global sense. We can make those situations tolerable by dealing with specific projects and responding to them in responsible ways. And we have to keep our mind open to what they are. It's no longer just, oh, there's a site, let's do a building. It's so contextual, and that was really the point of this, is not to say, oh, you know, tall buildings are this and that. It's to say that they are a means to really improve the environment, both socially, culturally, sustainably, and I don't see it any other way. So, and you know, no one's ever going to take away all the other housing options. It's about options. It's about giving people options, and the question about, you know, affordability is the really relevant topic. How do we make? I'm great. I live in the sky. I wake up every morning. Well, COVID lockdown, I'm sitting in my study at home looking at the weather, and you know, I'm having a great time. There are kids down there who are in little apartments, and they don't have that privilege. How do we make that equitable? How do we make places for people that don't have the means to live in privileged accommodation? That's the real question.
Okay, I think
Yeah.
you've probably talked out. Less than 100 metres from here, we can go into Temple Bar and get a drink, and you can appreciate that very fine Wren room, which is a very good demonstration of flexibility and sustainability. It's in its third location, 350 years old, so the room is quite congested, so if you have a drink you might want to come back down here, and then we'll be serving canapes. So Karl, thank you very much.